The strangest thing about ancient humans is not that they vanished. It is that some of them may not have vanished in the way we imagine. We picture disappearance as silence, as empty caves, abandoned tools, bones left under dust. But the colder truth is more unsettling. A human group can disappear from the earth and still leave traces inside the bodies of people who never knew their names. They can lose their voices, their faces, their stories, and yet remain as small fragments in blood, memory, and survival. So when we say ancient humans vanished, what are we really saying disappeared? The strangest thing about asking why ancient humans vanished is that the question already carries a picture inside it. It makes us imagine a final night, a last fire, a cave mouth growing cold, a few stone tools left where no hand would ever lift them again. It makes disappearance feel like a door closing. But human history is rarely that clean. A people can fade from the record without vanishing in a single moment. A kind of human can stop being visible to archaeologists, while pieces of their life continue in ways that are harder to see. When we speak of ancient humans, we are not speaking about shadows from a myth or creatures from a story made to frighten us before sleep. We are speaking about real human relatives who breathed cold air, shaped stone, knew hunger, learned landscapes, protected children, followed animals, buried or lost their dead, and left behind only a broken handful of signs. Some of those signs are bones, some are tools, some are traces of hearths, and some are inside living people in the quiet language of DNA, where the past does not look like a ruin, but like a faint thread still woven into the present. That is why the word vanished must be handled carefully. It can mean that a group died out. It can mean that a way of life ended. It can mean that a population became too small to continue as a separate people. It can mean that one human world was absorbed into another until no one remained who could say, "This is us, and that is them." For the deep past, these meanings can overlap, and if we rush too quickly, we turn a difficult truth into a simple story. We may imagine ancient humans disappearing because they were weak, or foolish, or less complete than us, but that is not what the evidence allows us to say. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other ancient human groups were not failed drafts waiting for Homo sapiens to arrive. They were adapted to places, seasons, and dangers that would have tested any human body. They lived for hundreds of thousands of years in worlds that were often colder, harsher, and less predictable than the one most of us know. To vanish after such a long existence is not the same as never having succeeded. It may be closer to being slowly pressed by many forces at once: climate, small numbers, changing food, movement of other humans, chance, isolation, and contact. This first part of the story begins with that correction. We must slow down before we ask why they vanished, because the word itself may mislead us. If an ancient group leaves no living community with its own name, language, children, and memory, we say it is gone. Yet if some of its ancestry still remains inside later people, then the disappearance is not pure erasure. It is more like a river losing its visible channel after joining a larger stream. The water is still there, but the old banks can no longer be followed with the eye. This does not make the loss smaller. In some ways, it makes it more intimate. It means the end of an ancient human group may not have looked like a dramatic collapse. It may have looked like scattered families, fewer children, changing camps, longer distances between neighbours, unfamiliar footprints near old hunting grounds, and children born into mixed communities who no longer inherited a single world. Over many generations, the distinction that once seemed clear could grow thinner, until only bones, tools, and genetic traces remained to tell us that another kind of human had once stood under the same sky. So the central question is not simply, why did they die? It is, why did they stop remaining separate enough for history, archaeology, and inheritance to recognize them as their own continuing people? That is a quieter question, but it is also a more honest one. It does not give us a villain. It does not give us a single final day. It asks us to look at disappearance as a process, not an event, and to accept that ancient humans may have vanished in more than one way at the same time. When we look backward into deep time, we often forget how much of a human life leaves almost nothing behind. A person may have walked the same valley for 40 years, known every bend of a river, every place where stone could be struck into a sharp edge, every sheltered hollow where a child could sleep out of the wind, and still leave no name for us to recover. Their voice is gone first, then their gestures, then the small habits that made one family different from another, the way they shared meat, the way they warned children away from thin ice, the way they watched the sky before moving camp, the way an old woman may have remembered a dry season from long before anyone else was born. These things are not usually preserved in the earth. Archaeology can find a tool, but not the hand's memory of using it. It can find a bone, but not the fear or patience that once lived around it. This is why the disappearance of ancient humans can feel sharper than ordinary death. It is not only bodies that are missing. Entire ways of being human have slipped beyond reach. And yet, even here, we must be careful. The silence of the record is not the same as proof that life ended suddenly. A place may look empty to us because the people who used it moved elsewhere. A tool tradition may fade because another method became more useful, or because groups met and learned from one another, or because the people who made those tools became part of a different population. A kind of human may seem to vanish from the ground long before the last descendant of that population truly disappeared. This is one of the quiet difficulties in asking why ancient humans vanished. We are not watching their world directly. We are reading signs left behind by accident, survival, and decay. Stone lasts longer than wood, teeth last longer than skin. Cold caves preserve more than open grasslands. Dry places remember differently from wet places. A human group that lived gently along rivers, under branches, using wood, fibre, hide, and memory, could have mattered deeply in its own time and still leave almost nothing that would survive for us. So when we say a group vanished, part of what we mean is that the material traces we can recognize became too rare, too scattered, or too blended with other traces to follow clearly. This does not make the question less important, it makes it more human, because the story is not only about extinction in the biological sense, it is also about visibility. Who remains visible after tens of thousands of years? Who becomes a fossil, a genome, a tool layer, a faint mark in sediment? Who is lost because the earth did not keep their shelter, their songs, their winter plans, their children's names? Ancient humans did not vanish into a blank world. They vanished into a world that kept only certain kinds of evidence. That means our picture is always incomplete. It also means we should not fill the empty spaces with dramatic certainty. It is tempting to imagine a simple replacement, one group arriving, another group disappearing, as if history were a line drawn over another line. But deep human history seems less like a clean drawing and more like overlapping footprints after rain. Some prints are clear, some are broken, some are stepped into by later feet. Some disappear before the path reaches the edge of the valley. If we follow only the clearest marks, we may mistake the surviving evidence for the whole truth. The vanished humans at the center of this question were not only species names in a museum, they were populations living in real places, under changing weather, with small numbers, uncertain food, and contact with other humans whose presence could mean danger, opportunity, distance, exchange, or kinship. Their disappearance must be understood inside that uncertainty. It was not just the end of bones in the ground, it was the thinning of recognizable difference. It was the moment when a separate human presence became too faint for later ages to hold on to, even if some part of it continued quietly beyond sight. And this is why the first step in the story is not to hunt for one cause, but to ask what kind of disappearance we are trying to explain. To understand why ancient humans vanished, we first have to let go of the idea that the past behaves like a story with clean edges. In a simple story, one people ends, another begins, and the line between them is easy to see. But the deeper we look into human origins, the less that kind of line seems to hold. Ancient human groups did not live as labels. They did not know themselves as Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, or any name later given by scientists. They lived as families, bands, neighbors, strangers, hunters, children, elders, people who knew certain valleys and feared certain winters. The names we use now are tools for understanding, not the way their lives were experienced from the inside. And that matters, because a label can vanish from the record while the lives behind it ended in many different ways. Some people may have died without descendants. Some may have had children with members of other groups. Some may have moved into places where their traces were not preserved. Some may have changed their tools, their routes, their habits, or their partners, until later evidence no longer separates them clearly. From a great distance, all of these endings can blur together and appear as one disappearance. But for the people living through it, there may never have been one clear moment when anyone knew that an ancient human world was ending. There may have been no final announcement, no last tribe standing at the edge of history, no single day when one kind of human looked around and realized it would not continue. There may only have been harder seasons, smaller groups, fewer familiar faces, new people crossing old landscapes, children growing up with mixed ancestry, and memories thinning as elders died. This is why the disappearance of ancient humans is not only a question of bones, it is also a question of continuity. What must continue for a people to remain itself? Is it the shape of the skeleton, the tools placed beside a hearth, the language spoken around a fire, the choice of a mate, the memory of where ancestors once camped? The answer is not simple, especially when we speak about tens of thousands of years. A human group can remain biologically connected to the future while losing its separate identity. It can leave genetic traces but no living voice. It can influence later survival without being remembered by name. In that sense, vanishing is not always a clean disappearance from existence. Sometimes it is the loss of being recognizable as oneself. For ancient humans, this distinction is central. If we confuse loss of identity with sudden extinction, we may create a false drama. If we imagine every disappearance as a defeat, we may miss the slower truth, that survival itself can change the shape of a people until the original boundary can no longer be seen. This does not mean every ancient human group survived in some hidden way. Many populations truly ended. Many lines left no known descendants. The fossil record shows that the human family tree once had more branches than it has now, and most of those branches are no longer represented by living communities. But even here, the image of a tree can mislead us if we imagine branches simply snapping off one by one. Some branches may have crossed, touched, and carried parts of one another forward. Some may have grown close enough that later eyes cannot easily separate them. Some may have ended in silence, while others ended by becoming part of a different human stream. The honest beginning, then, is not to choose one explanation too early. It is to hold several kinds of disappearance in the mind at once: death without descendants, shrinking numbers, broken communities, changing environments, loss of cultural continuity, and absorption into other populations. Only after making that distinction can the larger story begin. Because the ancient humans who vanished did not vanish from an empty stage. They lived in a crowded human past, a world where more than one kind of human walked, adapted, suffered, learned, and sometimes met. Before we can ask why one line continued while others faded, we have to enter that older world without assuming that our own presence at the end of the story makes the ending obvious. Before the question of vanishing can become clear, we have to step into a world that feels unfamiliar to the modern imagination. Today, there is only one living human species, and because of that, it is easy to believe that this was always the natural shape of the earth. One kind of human, one line, one story, slowly becoming us. But for much of the deep past, the human world was not so alone. It was wider, stranger, and more crowded than our ordinary picture allows. There were times when different human groups, close enough to be our relatives but not identical to us, lived across parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia. Some were known from skulls, teeth, tools, and fragments of bone. Some are known mostly from DNA pulled from remains so small that, without modern science, they might have seemed almost meaningless. The names we give them now are quiet and technical: Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, and others whose exact relationships are still studied and sometimes debated. But behind those names were not museum categories. Behind them were breathing communities. They had bodies shaped by climate and movement. They had children who needed warmth. They had old people who carried knowledge no stone tool could fully preserve. They had places they returned to, animals they understood, seasons they trusted until the seasons changed. To say that ancient humans vanished then is not to imagine one lonely group disappearing from a world that already belonged to us. It is to remember that our ancestors once shared the planet with other humans, and that the world we inherited is the narrowed remainder of a much broader human past. This is not a fantasy of lost civilizations, and it should not be told as if every cave hides a secret empire. The evidence is quieter than that, but also deeper. Fossils show forms of human life that were not exactly modern Homo sapiens. Ancient DNA shows that some of these groups met and mixed. Archaeological sites show repeated occupation, movement, adaptation, and change across long periods of time. The picture is incomplete, but it is enough to unsettle the simple idea that humanity was always a single road. There were branches, there were crossings, there were places where different human groups may have known of one another, avoided one another, learned from one another, or had children together. And once we understand this, the question becomes heavier. Why did only one kind of human remain as a living, visible species today? Why do we not wake into a world where Neanderthal communities still keep their own languages, where Denisovan descendants still know their own mountains, where other ancient human lines still walk beside ours as neighbors rather than as fragments in bone and DNA? The answer is not ready yet, and we should not force it. At the beginning of this second movement, the important thing is only to feel the scale of what was lost. The vanishing of ancient humans was not the removal of a few isolated figures from the edge of history. It was the closing of many possible human futures. A valley that once may have known more than one kind of human now knows only one. A continent that once held overlapping traces now offers scattered remains. The modern world feels normal because it is the only world we have lived in, but it is not the only human world that ever existed. For hundreds of thousands of years, human life had more variety than our present can easily imagine. Some groups were close cousins, some were older branches, some may have been known only in certain regions, surviving in small numbers, leaving very little behind. Their disappearance cannot be understood if we begin with the assumption that Homo sapiens was always destined to be alone. Destiny is too easy a word. It makes the outcome feel planned. But the deep past was not moving toward us with certainty. It was made of migrations, cold years, warm years, births, deaths, accidents, meetings, hunger, invention, isolation, and chance. The fact that we are the only ones left does not mean the others were never fully human in their own ways. It means that, over time, the many-shaped human world became a single surviving line. And the reasons for that narrowing are still among the most difficult and humbling questions in human origins. To live in a world with more than one kind of human is difficult for us to imagine, because our own world has trained us to see humanity as a single face. Everywhere people differ in language, skin, clothing, belief, and memory. But beneath those differences we recognize one living human species. The deep past was not arranged so simply. There were long stretches of time when a traveller moving across landscapes would not only meet people from another band or another region, but might, in some places and periods, encounter humans whose bodies had been shaped by a different evolutionary path. They were not monsters, and they were not unfinished versions of us. They were other human relatives, close enough to share ancestry, close enough in some cases to leave descendants through mixing, but different enough that their bones, teeth, and genetic traces tell us they belong to distinct populations. This is important because the question of why ancient humans vanished often becomes distorted when we imagine only one center and many failures around it. We place Homo sapiens in the middle, as if every other group existed only to disappear. But that is a view from the end of the road, not from the road itself. For most of their lives, Neanderthals did not know they were living in the shadow of a future species that would one day study them. Denisovans did not know they would be known mostly from fragments, a finger bone, teeth, a jaw, traces of DNA carried into later populations. Other ancient humans did not know that their names would be assigned long after their fires were cold. They simply lived inside their own present. They woke to weather, hunger, injury, birth, and movement. They learned which stones broke cleanly, which plants could be used, which animals were dangerous, which paths became impossible under snow or rain. Their worlds were not footnotes to ours. They were complete to them. If we keep this in mind, their vanishing becomes less like the failure of a lesser species and more like the loss of entire human possibilities. A Neanderthal child growing in a cold region of Ice Age Europe was not an idea waiting to be replaced. A Denisovan group somewhere in Asia was not a mystery created for modern genetics. They were parts of a wider human landscape, and that landscape changed slowly. Some groups may have lived far apart for many generations. Others may have overlapped in certain regions, perhaps seeing signs of each other before meeting directly. A used shelter, a broken tool, a cut-marked bone, a path already taken through a pass. Contact did not have to mean one simple thing. It could mean fear, it could mean distance, it could mean curiosity, imitation, competition, violence, exchange, or partnership. In some cases, it meant children. Ancient DNA has made that part of the story harder to ignore. Some people living today carry small amounts of ancestry from ancient human groups, especially Neanderthals, and in some populations, Denisovan ancestry as well. This does not answer every question, and it does not turn disappearance into survival in the full sense. A few genetic fragments are not the same as a living community, with its own elders, stories, and future. But they remind us that the borders between ancient human groups were not always walls. Sometimes they were edges that could be crossed. This makes the idea of vanishing more complex. If one group meets another, has children with them, and over many generations becomes part of a larger population, did it vanish by dying, or did it vanish by losing its separate form? If its tools disappear but some ancestry remains, what exactly ended? If its bones become rare, but its biological traces continue quietly inside later humans, how should we describe the loss? These are not questions meant to create confusion for its own sake. They are necessary because the ancient world was not a simple stage where one kind of human replaced all the rest in a single movement. It was a shifting map of populations, some large, some small, some long-lived, some already fragile, all shaped by climate, geography, food, and chance. To understand why ancient humans vanished, we must first accept that the past was not empty before us. It was already human, but human in more than one way. When we imagine the ancient human world as crowded, we should not imagine it as crowded in the way a modern city is crowded. These groups were not always standing beside one another, not always meeting face to face, not always sharing the same caves or hunting the same animals at the same time. Their world was vast, uneven, and broken by mountains, deserts, forests, ice, rivers, and distances that could separate small communities for generations. One group might know a valley for centuries and never see the people beyond a far ridge. Another might move with animals across open land and leave only a few tools where the wind later covered them. Another might live near the edge of a changing climate, where every warm period opened new paths and every cold return closed them again. The human past was crowded not because every place was full, but because the earth held more than one human possibility at once. In some regions, those possibilities may have overlapped. In others, they may have passed through the same places at different times, leaving evidence that later appears close together even when the lives themselves were separated by many years. This is one reason the story must be told carefully. A map of fossils can make the past look more certain than it was. A dot on a map can seem like a settled home, when it may only mark the place where one fragment survived. A date range can seem like a clear border, when it may only be the best estimate from what has been found so far. Ancient humans did not live as fixed colours on a museum chart. They moved, retreated, expanded, met barriers, crossed them, and sometimes disappeared from one region while continuing in another. The world with more than one human was not stable. It breathed in and out with climate, food, population size, and chance. This matters because vanishing did not have to begin everywhere at once. A group might grow rare in one landscape but remain stronger elsewhere. A tool tradition might end in one region while a related population survived beyond the next range of hills. A human line might seem to fade from the fossil record not because every person was gone, but because the record itself becomes thin, or because people moved into places that did not preserve bone well, or because their descendants became harder to distinguish from others. The narrowing of the human world was probably not experienced as a single collapse. It may have been experienced as local changes. Fewer neighbours known by old signs, longer journeys between familiar camps, new kinds of tools appearing near old routes, animals shifting their paths, children learning from people whose grandparents had lived differently. For Homo sapiens too, the story was not a simple march of victory. Our own ancestors were small, vulnerable populations for much of their history, shaped by weather, hunger, disease, migration, and accident. The fact that one branch survived does not mean survival was guaranteed. It only means that after many crossings of chance and adaptation, one living human species remained visible at the end. The others became fossils, fragments, genetic traces, and questions. And perhaps this is the quiet shock beneath the title of this video. Ancient humans vanished not from a world that was waiting for them to fail, but from a world in which several human ways of being were possible. Their disappearance was the shrinking of human variety itself. Once there were different bodies carrying different histories through different landscapes. Once the word human, if anyone had been able to stand above time and see it all, would have pointed not to one surviving form, but to a family of forms spread unevenly across the earth. Some were closely related. Some were separated by deep time. Some met. Some never did. Some left descendants through mixing. Some left only bone. Some may still be known poorly because the ground has not given up enough of them. To ask why they vanished is therefore to ask why this wider family became so narrow. It is to ask why the old human plurality did not continue into the present. And as the story moves forward, the answer cannot rest on one cause alone. The world that held many humans was also a world of unstable climates, shifting habitats, small populations, uncertain food, and meetings that could change the future of a group without anyone understanding it at the time. Before we look at those pressures, we should carry one image with us. Not a ladder with Homo sapiens at the top, and not a battlefield where one side simply defeated the rest, but a dim landscape at the edge of morning, with many human footprints crossing damp ground. Some tracks continue, some fade, some merge with others, some vanish where the soil turns hard. The mystery is not only why the fading happened, it is why, after so many footprints, only one kind of human remained to look back and wonder where the others went. Climate did not erase ancient humans with a single storm, or one terrible winter, or one sudden wall of ice moving across the land like a punishment. That would be too simple, and too dramatic for the kind of truth the deep past usually gives us. The pressure of climate was slower than fear, and often more powerful because of that. It worked through seasons. It worked through the animals people followed, the plants that returned or failed to return, the rivers that changed their edges, the forests that opened into grassland, the grasslands that became colder and drier, the familiar valleys that no longer gave what they had once given. For ancient humans living in small groups, the world was not an abstract environment. It was a memory map. A bend in a river might mean fish at one time of year. A slope might mean edible roots after thaw. A stand of trees might mean shelter, wood, and animals passing nearby. A cave or rock overhang might mean safety through a long cold night. When climate shifted, it did not simply change the background of life. It changed the meaning of places. A route that once helped a group survive could become useless. A hunting ground could empty. A warmer period could invite people into new land, and a colder return could close that land behind them. This matters for the question of why ancient humans vanished, because survival depends not only on intelligence, but on the fit between knowledge and world. A group can know its land deeply and still suffer if the land itself becomes less predictable. The older hunters may remember where herds crossed in their youth, but the herds may no longer come that way. The gatherers may know which sheltered places hold food after winter, but a long change in rainfall may make those plants rare. The makers of tools may still shape stone with skill, but sharp edges do not create animals where animals have moved away. In such a world, disappearance would not need to begin as catastrophe. It could begin as a small weakening repeated many times. A few hungry winters, a few births lost, a few elders gone before their knowledge could be passed fully to children, a few groups forced farther apart, so that meeting partners, exchanging knowledge, or joining with neighbors became harder. Over generations, these small losses could become a deep pressure on a population already living close to the edge. When we think of vanished ancient humans, especially groups such as Neanderthals who lived through changing Ice Age environments, we should not imagine them as helpless before nature. That would be false. They endured cold regions for an extraordinary length of time. They made tools, used fire, hunted large animals, moved through difficult landscapes, and adapted to conditions that would challenge any human community. Their long survival is part of the evidence that they were capable, not evidence that they were doomed. But capability does not remove vulnerability. A skilled group can still be small. A knowledgeable group can still face too many changes at once. A people adapted to one pattern of land and season can be strained when that pattern keeps shifting. Climate, in this sense, was not a simple killer. It was a force that rearranged the stage on which every other pressure acted. It could reduce food, divide groups, open paths for some humans while closing them for others, push populations into contact, or isolate them in places where their numbers became too thin. It could make a familiar world unfamiliar without asking whether the people inside it were ready. And when ancient humans vanished, some part of that vanishing may have begun in this quiet mismatch between memory and change. The old knowledge still held in the mind, the old places still named in whatever language they used, but the animals moving differently, the cold lasting longer, the rain coming late, the shelter no longer enough, and the future growing narrower, without anyone knowing that a whole human line might one day be remembered only by its bones. When climate changes, the first thing a human group feels is not the word climate. No one sitting beside a small fire in the Ice Age would have spoken of global patterns, long cycles, or shifting habitats in the way modern science does. They would have felt it through the body, the air biting earlier in the season, snow staying longer on the ground, a river running lower than it once did, a herd arriving late or not arriving at all, a familiar patch of berries failing for several years, a child coughing through a cold spring, a mother walking farther to find enough food, a hunter returning with less than expected, not because he had forgotten how to hunt, but because the animals had changed their routes. This is how a large force enters a small life. It does not announce itself. It changes what people can count on. And for ancient humans, what could be counted on was often the difference between continuity and disappearance. A group might survive one bad season by sharing more carefully, moving sooner, staying longer in a protected place, or relying on stored memory from older people. But if the pattern kept shifting, the old solutions could become less reliable. Food is not only food. It is also timing, distance, cooperation, strength, memory, and risk. If animals move farther away, people must spend more energy following them. If plants become rare in a region, children and elders may have fewer soft foods when meat is scarce. If water sources become uncertain, routes between camps may grow dangerous. If cold stretches become harder, clothing, fuel, and shelter matter more, and every injury becomes more serious. These pressures do not prove that climate alone made ancient humans vanish, but they show how climate could weaken the foundations that allowed small groups to remain alive as separate communities. A people does not need to be destroyed in one moment to disappear. It can be stretched until its connections thin. One camp moves north while another stays near a river. One family joins a neighboring group because there are too few mates nearby. Another group loses elders before children have learned all the old roots. A region that once held several small bands may slowly hold fewer, not because anyone chose an ending, but because the land no longer supports the same pattern of life. This is especially important for ancient humans, because many groups were not large populations spread evenly across continents. They often lived in small, scattered communities, and small communities are sensitive to repeated stress. If food becomes less predictable, the effects move through everything. Births may become fewer, children may be harder to raise, injured adults may not recover as well. Young people may leave or be taken into other groups. Knowledge may become local and fragile. The disappearance of ancient humans, seen from far away, may look like the fading of a species or a branch of the human family. But from within, it may have felt like a series of practical decisions. Move now, wait longer, follow the herd, leave the old shelter, cross the ridge, seek another group, take a stranger as kin, abandon a place that grandparents once trusted. Climate can also change who meets whom. When ice expands, land routes may close, and populations may become isolated. When climates warm, new routes may open, bringing groups into contact that had once lived apart. A changing environment can therefore both separate and connect. It can trap one population in a shrinking refuge, while allowing another to spread into newly usable land. It can make one valley emptier and another more crowded. It can turn strangers into competitors for the same animals, or into partners when survival depends on joining. This is where the question of vanishing becomes more complicated again. If an ancient group under climate stress meets another group with different tools, different routes, or larger numbers, the result does not have to be immediate violence. It could be avoidance. It could be learning. It could be small conflict. It could be intermarriage. It could be gradual absorption. The climate may not be the final cause by itself, but it can create the conditions under which other causes become stronger. It can make a population smaller before contact happens. It can force movement before a group is ready. It can weaken the old balance between people and place. And once that balance breaks, identity itself may become harder to preserve. Ancient humans vanished, in part because the world they knew did not stay still long enough for every group to continue as it had before. The cold truth is not that they were unable to adapt. Many of them adapted for astonishing spans of time. The colder truth is that adaptation has limits when change repeats, food shifts, numbers are small, and the distance between living and disappearing may be only a few hard generations. There is a quiet mistake people often make when they hear that climate may have helped ancient humans vanish. They imagine cold as the enemy, as if the story were only about bodies freezing beneath a hard sky. Cold mattered, of course. So did heat, drought, wet seasons, deep snow, dry grass, shrinking forests, and changing coastlines. But the deeper danger was not always the temperature itself. It was what change did to the web of life around a human group. Climate moved the edges of forests. It shifted the open lands where large animals grazed. It changed the plants that appeared after thaw. It changed the insects, the birds, the small animals, the fish, the water, the wood for fire, the hides available for clothing, and the paths that linked one human band to another. A group might still have sharp tools, strong arms, memory, and courage, and yet find that the old web no longer held them in the same way. This is why climate belongs near the beginning of the answer, but not at the end of it. It is not a single explanation. It is the ground under many explanations. When the ground shifts, everything standing on it must adjust. For ancient humans, especially those living in small and scattered groups, adjustment could be slow, costly, and uncertain. Moving into a new region was not like moving on a map. It meant learning where water stayed clean, where stone could be found, where animals crossed, where snow collected, where danger waited, where shelter was possible, where strangers might already be living. It meant carrying children, protecting the injured, keeping fire alive, finding food before hunger weakened the group too much to continue. The land did not simply open because people needed it. Every new place had to be learned by bodies moving through it. Every mistake had a cost. If the group was large, mistakes might be absorbed. If the group was small, a few mistakes could change the future. This is one of the reasons the vanishing of ancient humans cannot be separated from population size. Climate pressure does not act on an empty species name. It acts on real communities, often small ones, where every birth matters, every death removes knowledge, and every lost connection makes the next season harder. A long, cold period, or a pattern of sudden changes between cold and warm, may not kill a group directly, but it can reduce the number of children who live. It can make travel more dangerous. It can separate related bands so they meet less often. It can make it harder to find partners outside the immediate group. It can make hunger more common, injuries more serious, and old knowledge less dependable. Slowly, the community becomes thinner, not only thinner in bodies, but thinner in options. There are fewer people to remember alternate routes, fewer hands to care for the weak, fewer young adults to hunt, gather, carry, and learn, fewer chances to join with another group before isolation becomes dangerous. And once a population becomes thin enough, disappearance can begin to happen even without a dramatic disaster. A few families may join others, a few lines may leave no descendants, a small band may fail to replace itself. A region may be abandoned, then remembered only by tools buried in sediment. Later, when scientists find gaps in the record, it may look like a vanishing. From within, it may have felt like survival, one decision at a time, until the separate path was no longer there. This is the patient cruelty of environmental change. It does not need to prove that ancient humans were weak. It tests the distance between skill and circumstance. Neanderthals and other ancient humans survived difficult climates for immense spans of time, which means they were not simply defeated by cold. But no adaptation is infinite. A body adapted to cold still needs food. A group skilled in hunting still needs animals within reach. A community rich in knowledge still needs enough children, enough partners, enough neighboring groups, enough safe seasons for that knowledge to continue. When climate changed repeatedly, it may have narrowed all of those things at once. And this is where the story begins to move toward the next pressure. The ancient human world did not only change from the outside, it also changed from within the fragile mathematics of small communities. A group can survive a harsh winter and still be weaker afterward. It can cross a dangerous landscape and still lose the elder who knew the old songs, the young hunter who knew the ridge paths, the mother whose child might have carried the line forward. It can continue for a while, still human, still intelligent, still awake beneath the same stars, but with fewer people, each generation to hold the world together. Climate may have pushed, but small numbers made the push matter more. And once we understand that, the question of why ancient humans vanished becomes even quieter and even more serious. Perhaps disappearance did not begin when the last person died. Perhaps it began earlier, when a living group still had fire, tools, memory, and hope, but no longer had enough people for its separate future to remain secure. A human group does not need to be foolish to disappear. It does not need to forget how to make tools, or lose the use of fire, or stop understanding the land beneath its feet. Sometimes a group becomes vulnerable simply because there are too few people left inside it. This is one of the coldest truths in the story of ancient humans, because it removes the comfort of blaming disappearance on weakness. A small community can be skilled, careful, observant, and deeply adapted to its world, and still live close to a dangerous edge. Every person matters more when numbers are low. Every child who does not survive changes the future. Every adult lost to injury, infection, hunger, childbirth, conflict, or accident removes not only a body, but a set of memories, relationships, and abilities that may not be easily replaced. In a large population, one death is grief, but the group continues with many others carrying similar knowledge. In a small band, one death can change: who hunts, who gathers, who protects, who teaches, who remembers, who knows the route across a ridge after snow, who can calm a frightened child, who can recognize the sign of animals before anyone else sees them. This is why small numbers matter so deeply when we ask why ancient humans vanished. Disappearance may not begin with a disaster. It may begin with a population becoming too thin to repair ordinary losses. We often picture survival as a matter of strength against nature, but for ancient humans, survival was also a matter of continuity between generations. A child had to be born, kept warm, fed through hard seasons, protected during movement, and taught slowly over years. Young people had to reach adulthood. Adults had to find partners who were not too closely related, or join with neighboring groups often enough to keep families healthy. Elders had to live long enough for their knowledge to pass into younger bodies. None of this was guaranteed. When communities were scattered across large landscapes, distance itself could become a danger. A neighboring band might be beyond a river, beyond a ridge, beyond land made difficult by ice or drought. If contact became rare, the group's future narrowed. There might still be laughter beside the fire. There might still be careful hands shaping stone. There might still be people who knew the old places by smell, slope, and shadow. But if there were not enough children, not enough unrelated partners, not enough neighboring ties, then the separate path of that community could quietly weaken. This is not the same as saying every ancient human group was tiny all the time, or that small numbers alone explain every disappearance. The human past was varied, and the evidence is incomplete. But population size is one of the pressures that makes all other pressures more serious. A cold season hurts more when there are fewer hunters. A lost elder matters more when fewer people know the older routes. A failed birth matters more when births are already rare. A group forced to move has fewer options when it cannot send scouts, care for the weak, and carry children at the same time. Smallness turns ordinary misfortune into history. It turns a broken leg, a bad winter, a sickness, or a missed meeting with another group into something that may echo for generations. And for ancient humans who lived in scattered communities, especially in difficult climates and changing landscapes, those echoes could become part of vanishing. The people inside such a group would not have thought of themselves as nearing extinction. That word belongs to us, looking backward. They may only have known that there were fewer voices than before, that a shelter once used by relatives now stood empty, that a young person had to travel farther to find a partner, that a child grew up, hearing stories of people they would never meet. They may have continued living with patience and intelligence long after their future had become fragile. This is what makes the disappearance of ancient humans so quiet. It may have happened while life still looked like life. Fires lit in the evening, tools repaired, meat shared, children sleeping against warm hides, eyes watching the dark beyond the camp. Yet beneath those ordinary acts, the mathematics of survival could already be turning against them. Not because they were less human, but because being human has always depended on others. A mind alone cannot keep a people alive. A tool alone cannot keep ancestry moving forward. A memory alone cannot become a future unless there are enough living people to receive it. In the deep past, a community could vanish not when its last fire went out, but when its circle became too small to hold the next generation securely. Small groups are fragile not only because there are few bodies, but because there are few connections. A human community is not simply a number of people gathered near a fire. It is a web of kinship, memory, trust, obligation, shared work, and possible futures. In the deep past, that web may have been the difference between a group that continued and a group that slowly disappeared into others or left no descendants at all. A child did not survive only because one parent loved it. A child survived because several people could help carry food, watch for danger, tend fire, share warmth, teach hands how to hold stone, and remember when to move. An injured hunter did not survive only because he was strong. He survived if others could feed him while he healed. An elder did not matter only because of age. An elder mattered because memory itself was a kind of tool, and in a world without writing, the loss of memory could be as serious as the loss of a blade. When there are many people across connected groups, knowledge can be held in more than one body. Routes can be remembered by several families. Food sources can be known by different bands. Young adults can find partners beyond their closest relatives. Children can grow up surrounded by many models of how to live. But when a population becomes very small or very isolated, the web tightens until every broken strand matters. A missed meeting with another group is not only a social absence. It may mean fewer mates, fewer exchanges, fewer stories of distant conditions, fewer warnings about empty valleys or dangerous weather. A group may still know how to survive its own immediate land, but lose awareness of what is happening beyond the next ridge. That matters when the land changes. It matters when animals move. It matters when another human group enters a region. It matters when a young person needs to leave one camp and be accepted into another. Ancient humans did not vanish simply because they faced nature. They may also have vanished because the human networks that make survival flexible became too thin. This is a quieter idea than battle or disaster, but it may be closer to the way disappearance often works. Imagine a small community that has survived for generations in a cold valley. They know the sheltering rocks, the wind patterns, the crossings used by animals, the place where good stone can be found. Their world is not primitive to them. It is detailed, named, practiced, and remembered. But beyond that valley, other related groups are fewer than they once were. A band that used to arrive in a certain season no longer comes. A young woman who might once have joined relatives farther away has no safe path to reach them. A child hears stories of cousins across the hills but never sees them. A tool style once shared across many camps begins to differ, not because people become less intelligent, but because fewer hands meet and fewer ideas travel. Over time, isolation can make a group appear unchanged from the outside, while making its future less secure from within. There may still be food for a while. There may still be fire, laughter, teaching, repair, and care. But the circle is smaller. The choices are fewer. If sickness enters, there are fewer helpers. If several children die young, there are fewer chances to recover. If partners are too closely related, the health of future generations may suffer. If young adults leave to join another population, the old group may continue biologically through them, but not as the same separate community. This is one way ancient humans could vanish without a single moment of destruction. The group does not fall like a wall. It thins like smoke. Some people die. Some move. Some marry or join into others. Some knowledge is carried forward, but not under the same identity. Some tools are remembered. Some are abandoned. Some are blended with new habits. A later archaeologist may see a break in the material record and wonder what happened, but the break may hide many small human choices made under pressure. Stay or move, keep apart or join. Teach the old way or copy a new one. Protect the child here or send the young person away where the future may be better. None of these choices need to feel like the end of a people while they are being made. They are survival choices. Yet survival choices can still dissolve a separate line over generations. This is why the vanishing of ancient humans should not be imagined only as death. Sometimes the danger to a small group is not that no one survives, but that survival requires becoming part of something else. A few descendants may continue, but the old voice of the community becomes harder to hear. The separate memory fades. The old routes are no longer walked by people who belong only to that group. The children grow up with mixed ties, new habits, and a different circle of belonging. From the viewpoint of life, something continued. From the viewpoint of identity, something ended. And in the ancient human story, where the evidence is scattered and incomplete, this kind of ending may have been as important as any winter, any hunger, or any direct conflict. A small group can remain alive for a long time, yet already be losing the network that allows it to remain itself. The fragility of a small human group is difficult to see from the outside, because life can continue almost normally while the future is already becoming uncertain. A fire still burns. Someone still cracks bone for marrow. Someone still repairs a hide with careful fingers. Children still copy the movements of adults. A group still wakes, eats, watches the weather, follows tracks, and sleeps close together against the cold. Nothing in such a scene looks like an ending, yet deep inside that ordinary life, the balance may already be changing. If there are too few children, the next generation will be smaller. If there are too few young adults, travel and hunting become harder. If there are too few elders, memory becomes thinner. If there are too few neighboring groups, marriage, exchange, and help in hard times become less certain. A community can still be alive and already losing the conditions that allow it to remain a community. This is one of the most important ways to understand why ancient humans vanished. We should not imagine disappearance only as the last person of a kind dying alone. Long before that, a group may lose its ability to replace itself, to teach itself, to connect itself, and to name itself as a separate people. In the deep past, there were no written records to hold identity after the living voices were gone. A group continued only if bodies, memory, practice, and relationships continued together. If one of those strands weakened, the others had to carry more weight. If several weakened at the same time, the group might survive for a while, but its separate future would grow uncertain. This may sound abstract when said from far away, but in a small ancient community, it would have been felt through simple details. A young man looking for a partner may find that the band once met in spring no longer comes. A girl learning to scrape hides may have only one older woman left to teach her. A child may hear fewer stories of distant camps because fewer relatives return from those places. A sick adult may survive one winter because others help, but the effort leaves the group weaker when food becomes scarce. A death in childbirth may take a mother and a child at once, and with them a line that might have carried the group forward. None of these events has to be unusual. They are ordinary human risks. But when a population is small, ordinary risks become large. They do not need to happen every day. They only need to repeat often enough that each generation begins with fewer possibilities than the last. This is why small numbers can turn time itself into pressure. A large population has room for recovery. It can lose people and still contain many families, many skills, many possible partners, many routes of movement. A small population has less room. It can be brave and still be cornered by arithmetic. It can be knowledgeable and still be limited by births and deaths. It can adapt and still not adapt fast enough to preserve its own separate identity. When we ask why ancient humans vanished, this fragile arithmetic must stay near the center of the story. It does not replace climate, or contact with Homo sapiens, or changes in tools or chance. It makes all of them more powerful. A changing climate is more dangerous to a small group than to a large one. Contact with another population is more transformative when one group is already thin. A lost tool tradition matters more when fewer people carry it. A sickness matters more when there are not enough caregivers. Isolation matters more when there are not enough neighboring bands to reconnect with. Over time, these pressures can make a group less visible in every way. Fewer bodies leave fewer bones, fewer camps leave fewer hearths. Fewer toolmakers leave fewer recognizable patterns in stone. Fewer children carry fewer lines into the future. And if some descendants join another population, then biological survival may continue while the old community disappears from recognition. This is why the vanishing of ancient humans can be both real and incomplete. Real, because distinct groups truly stopped existing as separate living communities. Incomplete, because the ending may not have been a clean erasure. Some traces may have passed into others. Some knowledge may have been copied. Some ancestry may have continued without the old name, the old belonging, or the old face of the group. The tragedy, if we use that word carefully, is not only that ancient humans died. All humans die. The deeper loss is that entire circles of human life became too small to continue carrying themselves forward. Their endings may have been quiet enough that no one living then could see the full shape of them. A group may have believed it was only surviving another difficult season, only joining relatives, only moving away from an empty hunting ground, only sending young people toward a safer future. But from the distance of thousands of years, those choices may have formed the path by which a human world ceased to remain separate. In that sense, Ancient humans vanished not only because the earth changed around them, but because small communities can only endure so much thinning before life continues in another form, or does not continue at all. A stone tool can tell us that an ancient human hand understood more than survival in the simplest sense. It tells us that someone could see possibility inside a piece of rock before the edge existed. Someone knew how to choose the right material, how to strike at the right angle, how to make a sharp surface appear through patience and memory. A hearth can tell us that fire was not only heat, but a center of life, a way to cook, to see, to gather, to hold back the dark, to make a place feel briefly safer than the open land around it. Cut marks on bone can tell us that ancient humans knew how to process animals, how to divide meat, how to use what a body gave. Scrapers, points, flakes, worked bones, pigments, shelters, and repeated traces of occupation all remind us that the humans who vanished were not empty-handed. They were not passive creatures waiting for the world to decide their fate. They acted on the world, they learnt it, they shaped material, they returned to useful places, they carried knowledge forward through practice. And yet, this is where the question becomes more difficult. If they had tools, fire, hunting skill, memory, and adaptation, why did they vanish? The answer cannot be that they simply lacked intelligence. That would be too easy, and it would not respect the evidence. Many ancient human groups survived for immense lengths of time, far longer than most modern nations, languages, or ways of life have existed. Their tools were not accidents. Their use of landscapes was not random. Their endurance through harsh conditions was not a sign of failure. But skill is not the same as safety. A sharp tool can open a hide, but it cannot guarantee that animals will return. Fire can warm a shelter, but it cannot create enough children to carry a community forward. A well-known hunting route can guide a group across difficult land, but it cannot stop climate from changing the movement of herds. A tradition of making tools can last for generations, but it depends on people being alive to teach it, repeat it, and adapt it when the world changes. This is the quieter truth behind Truck 5. The presence of technology does not remove vulnerability. It only changes the shape of it. Ancient humans could be capable and still be fragile. They could make good decisions and still face conditions that no good decision could fully solve. They could know a landscape deeply and still find that the landscape no longer answered in the same way. This matters because modern minds often confuse invention with destiny. We look at tools and imagine progress as a staircase, each step leading upward toward control. But in the deep past, tools were not a guarantee of progress. They were ways of living inside uncertainty. A flake of stone helped with one task. A spear helped with one hunt. Fire helped through one night. A shelter helped during one season. None of these things made a small population large. None of them erased injury, hunger, childbirth risk, disease, isolation, or chance. A group could possess everything we would recognize as intelligence and still slowly lose its separate future. This is why the vanishing of ancient humans should never be told as if better tools simply defeated worse tools. The evidence does not allow such a clean moral. Different groups had different traditions, and those traditions changed over time. Some tools may have been more flexible in certain environments. Some methods may have spread through contact. Some habits may have been copied, blended, or abandoned. But no tool tradition exists outside the people who carry it. If the people are few, scattered, or under pressure, the tradition itself becomes vulnerable. A stone edge can last in the ground for tens of thousands of years, but the knowledge of making it can disappear in a single generation if there are too few teachers and too few learners. This is one of the strange reversals in the ancient record. The tool may survive longer than the community. The object remains, while the voice that explained it is gone. Later, we hold the stone and think we are touching certainty, but what we are really touching is the hardened shadow of a vanished relationship between hand, mind, land, and need. So when we ask why ancient humans vanished, tools should make us more humble, not more certain. They show that these humans were capable. They also show that capability had to be renewed every day. It had to be practiced in hunger, in cold, in movement, in childhood learning, in injury, in seasonal change. And if the chain of people became too thin, even a strong tool tradition could not save the separate world that created it. A tool is never only an object. It belongs to a whole way of moving through the world. A stone point makes sense because there are animals to hunt, hands trained to hold it, wood or bone to attach it to, people who know where to wait, and others who can help carry, butcher, share, and remember the hunt afterward. A scraper makes sense because there are hides to prepare, bodies to clothe, shelters to line, children to keep warm, and patient learners watching older hands. Fire makes sense because fuel can be found, sparks can be protected, embers can be carried or renewed, and the group has enough knowledge to keep warmth from becoming smoke and ash. When we look at ancient tools in museums or photographs, we often see them as signs of ability, and they are. But in the lives of the people who made them, tools were also signs of dependence. They depended on materials, weather, animals, roots, teaching, and cooperation. If any of those pieces changed, the tool did not become useless at once, but its certainty weakened. This is one reason ancient humans could be skilled and still disappear. Their technologies were not magic shields. They were working relationships with a changing world. If a group had long hunted certain animals, its weapons, movements, and seasonal memory might be beautifully suited to that pattern. But if those animals declined, shifted range, or became harder to predict, then the old skill had to stretch. If the group was large and well connected, new methods could spread. If it was small and isolated, adaptation was harder. Not because the people were incapable, but because change requires options. It requires time to experiment, enough food to survive mistakes, enough teachers to compare methods, enough young people to learn, enough contact with others to notice different solutions. A small group under pressure may know that the old way is becoming less reliable and still not have the freedom to invent its way out. Hunger narrows thought. Cold narrows movement. Injury narrows labor. Distance narrows exchange. In such conditions, even intelligence can become trapped inside immediate need. This is important for the question of why ancient humans vanished, because it prevents us from turning the story into a simple contest of better and worse tools. There may have been differences in technology between groups, and some differences may have mattered, but tools do not act by themselves. A slightly more flexible tool tradition might help one population in a shifting environment, while another tradition might remain powerful in a familiar one. A method that works well for large game in one region may not help as much when the landscape becomes patchier and food sources more varied. A group with broader social networks may receive new ideas more easily than a group separated by mountains, ice, or dwindling numbers. What looks like technological advantage from far away may actually be a mixture of population size, mobility, contact, food range, and timing. This is why we must be cautious. It is safer and more honest to say that technology was one part of survival, not the whole explanation for disappearance. Ancient humans who vanished may have known how to do many things well. They may have made exactly the tools their grandparents had trusted, tools that had carried people through many generations. Their hands may have been steady. Their memory may have been deep. Their children may have learned with the same patience children have always learned. But if the surrounding world changed faster than the tradition could adjust, the strength of that tradition could become a limit as well as a gift. A familiar tool teaches the hand what to expect. A familiar route teaches the mind where to go. A familiar way of hunting teaches the group how to organize itself. These are powerful forms of knowledge, but they can become fragile when the world no longer repeats itself. This does not mean ancient humans were stuck or unable to innovate. The archaeological record shows change, variation, and adaptation across ancient human lifeways. It simply means adaptation is never automatic. It must happen through living people under real pressure. A tool tradition continues only if enough people survive to use it, question it, modify it, and pass it on. When the chain becomes thin, even good knowledge can fail to travel forward. A child may learn part of a method, but not all of it. A young adult may leave to join another group and carry some habits into a new community. A small band may copy a useful technique from neighbors while losing older practices that once marked it as separate. Slowly, technology itself can become part of vanishing, not because the tools were weak, but because the people and relationships around them changed. A vanished group may leave behind stone edges that still look sharp to us, yet the living system that made those edges meaningful may be gone. The hand, the teacher, the animal, the season, the story of where the stone came from, the reason one shape was preferred over another, all of it fades. What remains is the object, silent and durable, while the human world that gave it purpose becomes harder to see. And in that silence, we should not hear proof of failure. We should hear the limit of every tool ever made. It can help life continue, but it cannot continue life by itself. The more we look at ancient tools, the more we should resist the urge to judge vanished humans by what they did not become. It is easy, from the safety of the present, to see a stone blade and think of everything that had not yet been invented. Writing, farming, metal, wheels, cities, maps, medicine, engines, glass, numbers fixed on a page. But that way of looking turns the ancient world into a waiting room for our own. It makes every older life appear incomplete, simply because it did not lead directly to the forms of power we recognize now. For the people who lived then, a well-made tool was not primitive. It was exact. It answered a need inside a world they knew with their bodies. A cutting edge could mean food before dark. A scraper could mean warmth for a child. A controlled fire could mean another night of safety. A wooden shaft, a sharpened point, a hide covering, a chosen stone, a remembered shelter. These were not small things. They were the structure of life. And still, even a strong structure can fail when too many beams are pressed at once. This is the point where skill and vulnerability meet. Ancient humans could know how to hunt and still face fewer animals. They could know how to make fire and still struggle when fuel was scarce or movement constant. They could know where to shelter and still find old shelters occupied, flooded, frozen, or far from food. They could know how to teach children, but lose children before the teaching was complete. They could know how to shape stone, but lose access to the best stone when roots changed or groups became isolated. They could have memory, but not enough people left to carry all of it. Skill is powerful, but it is not weightless. It must be carried by bodies that can become hungry, sick, injured, old, or separated. It must be renewed through children who survive long enough to learn. It must be flexible enough to change, but stable enough to remain useful. If a community is strong in one way and weak in another, the weakness may still decide its future. This is why the disappearance of ancient humans cannot be explained by pointing to tools alone, whether to praise them or dismiss them. Tools show us intelligence. They show us planning. They show us hands that learned from other hands. But they also show us dependence on continuity. A tool tradition is like a quiet conversation across generations. Someone learns by watching. Someone corrects the angle. Someone remembers which stone breaks cleanly. Someone knows which shape works for which task. Someone teaches without writing anything down. If that conversation becomes interrupted, the object may remain, but the living chain grows thin. A group under pressure may simplify, borrow, abandon, or merge practices. It may keep the useful parts and lose the parts that once made it distinct. In this way, technology can survive as fragments while identity fades. Some knowledge may pass into another population. Some habits may be absorbed. Some tools may be copied without the old stories that once surrounded them. From the outside, this could look like progress or replacement. From the inside, it may have felt like necessity. A young person may learn a new method from strangers because it works better in a changed landscape. A family may join a larger group because there are too few people left in its own. A camp may stop making an older form, not because it was foolish, but because the people who remembered why it mattered are gone. Over time, the material record changes, and we ask why ancient humans vanished. Part of the answer may be that their skills did not vanish all at once. Some of them may have continued in altered forms, while the separate communities that carried them dissolved. This is a difficult kind of ending, because it does not look like total failure. It looks like adaptation crossing the boundary into loss. A group survives by changing, but changes so deeply, or joins so completely, that later ages can no longer find it as itself. This is why tools, fire, shelter, and hunting knowledge must be treated with respect, but also with realism. They were not signs that ancient humans were doomed, and they were not proof that they could not disappear. They were signs of life working carefully against uncertainty. The tragedy of vanished ancient humans is not that they lacked ability. It is that ability still needed enough people, enough stability, enough contact, enough food, enough time, and enough luck to keep a separate human world alive. When those supports weakened together, even intelligence could not promise continuity. The Stone Age could remain sharp long after the people who made it had faded from the earth. The hearth could leave a dark stain long after no one remembered the voices around it. The shelter could collapse. The root could be forgotten. The child could grow into another community, and the old way of being human could pass quietly out of recognition. In the end, the tools do not answer why ancient humans vanished. They deepen the question. They tell us that those humans were capable, patient, and inventive, and then they leave us with the harder truth that capability alone has never been enough to keep any people safe forever. When Homo sapiens entered landscapes where other ancient humans had already lived for generations, the meeting did not have to look like the simple scene we sometimes imagine. It was not necessarily one group marching forward while another group vanished before them. It was not necessarily a clean conquest, and it was not necessarily peaceful closeness either. The truth is harder to picture, because it may have taken many forms in many places. In one valley, two groups may have avoided one another for years, reading each other only through broken tools, abandoned shelters, footprints near water, or animal bones cut in unfamiliar ways. In another region, people may have crossed the same hunting grounds in different seasons and rarely met face to face. Somewhere else, contact may have brought tension, injury, fear, theft, imitation, trade, or the slow recognition that another kind of human knew the land in a different way. And in some places, the evidence tells us that contact went even deeper, because children were born from the meeting of populations that had not always been the same. This is where the question of why ancient humans vanished becomes more delicate. The arrival or spread of Homo sapiens may have mattered greatly, but not always as a single violent answer. Contact itself can change a population without a dramatic battle. A group with larger numbers may use the same resources and make life harder for a smaller group nearby. A group with wider social networks may carry ideas, tools, mates, and news across longer distances, making it more flexible when conditions shift. A group entering new land may bring pressure simply by needing food, shelter, stone, water, and roots. No hatred is required for competition to exist. Two human groups can be intelligent, careful, and fully alive, yet still strain the same landscape if food is uncertain and numbers are unequal. At the same time, contact can also mean learning. A tool form may be copied. A route may become known. A method of preparing hides, using pigment, choosing stone, or organizing movement may pass from one group to another without leaving us a clear sign of who first taught whom. In the deep past, knowledge did not carry signatures. It moved through hands and eyes, through watching, sharing, taking, remembering, and changing. If Homo sapiens and other ancient humans met, they did not meet as symbols. They met as hungry bodies, cautious minds, families, strangers, possible threats, possible helpers, possible partners. The difficulty is that archaeology often preserves the harder things better than the softer ones. Stone may remain, bone may remain, DNA may remain. But a moment of hesitation between two groups does not fossilize. A gesture of warning does not stay in the ground. A night of uneasy sharing, a copied technique, a child accepted into another band, a conflict over a carcass, a young person leaving one people for another. These things may shape the future and leave only faint traces or no trace we can confidently read. That is why we should be careful not to turn the meeting with Homo sapiens into a story too neat for the evidence. Still, we cannot ignore it. By the time some ancient human groups were already living under climate pressure, with small populations and fragile networks, the presence of expanding Homo sapiens could have changed the balance. Even a small advantage in numbers, mobility, social connection, or flexibility might matter over many generations. It might mean more surviving children, more chances to find partners, more ways to recover after a hard season, more ability to move when one region failed. For a smaller ancient group already stretched thin, contact with a larger or more connected population could lead to several endings at once. Some people might die without descendants. Some might retreat into more marginal places. Some might join, willingly or out of necessity. Some might have children with newcomers. Some might carry old knowledge into a new community, while losing the separate identity that once held that knowledge together. In this way, Homo sapiens may have been part of why ancient humans vanished, but not always in the way a simple story wants. The pressure of our ancestors may have been physical, social, ecological, and genetic at the same time. It may have acted through competition and through kinship, through distance and through closeness, through fear and through need. And for the people living then, it may not have felt like the beginning of extinction. It may have felt like the arrival of unfamiliar tracks near a river, unfamiliar voices beyond the trees, unfamiliar hands shaping stone near an old shelter, and the slow understanding that the world no longer belonged only to the people who had known it before. Competition between human groups does not always announce itself with weapons. Sometimes it begins more quietly, with the same animal herd being followed by different eyes, the same shelter becoming useful to more than one band, the same river crossing holding footprints from people who do not belong to the same circle. In a difficult landscape, two groups do not have to hate each other for their needs to overlap. They only have to live near enough, want enough of the same things, and return to the same places at similar times. For ancient humans already facing climate shifts in small numbers, this kind of overlap could matter deeply. A valley that once fed one population may become less secure when another group begins using it. A source of good stone may become more dangerous to visit if unfamiliar people are nearby. A carcass found after a hunt may become a point of tension. A cave or rock shelter that protected one family through winter may no longer be empty when they return. None of these moments has to become a great battle. Many may have ended with distance, caution, retreat, or a change in route. But small changes in route can become large changes in survival. If a group avoids a good hunting ground because another population has become common there, it may need to spend more energy elsewhere. If it moves into poorer land, children and elders may suffer first. If it abandons a familiar shelter, old knowledge loses some of its usefulness. If it spends more time watching strangers than following animals, the cost is carried in hunger, fear, and fatigue. This is how Homo sapiens could have affected other ancient humans without every encounter becoming violent. Presence itself can be pressure. A larger or more connected population does not need to destroy a smaller one directly in order to change its future. It can draw resources into new patterns. It can occupy roots. It can make old places feel less safe. It can bring new alliances, new partners, new dangers, and new choices that did not exist before. Over many generations, these changes could slowly push a smaller group toward the edge of its own continuity. Yet the same contact that created competition could also create exchange. This is the part of the story that must remain open and careful. Ancient humans were not simple pieces on a board. They watched, learned, copied, and responded. If one group saw another using a different kind of tool, carrying fire in a different way, preparing hides with a different motion, or moving through the land with different timing, some knowledge may have crossed the boundary. We cannot always know who learned from whom, We should not assume that all useful ideas moved in only one direction. A group that later vanished may still have taught something to a group that continued. A method, a route, a warning about a place, a way of reading animals, or even a habit of making an object may have passed through contact and survived without the original community surviving separately. This possibility matters because it changes the feeling of disappearance. If ancient humans vanished partly through contact with Homo sapiens, then their ending may have included moments of influence as well as loss. The groups who disappeared were not silent obstacles in the path of our ancestors. They may have shaped the very humans among whom they later became invisible. In some cases, the influence was biological, through interbreeding. In others, it may have been behavioral, practical, and cultural, though these traces are harder to prove. The safer way to say it is this: contact between human groups can produce many outcomes at once, and the material record rarely preserves them all clearly. A broken tool may suggest activity, but not the relationship behind it. A genetic trace may show mixing, but not whether the people involved met through peace, tension, long familiarity, or necessity. A shift in tools may suggest change, but not whether it came from invention, imitation, movement, or replacement. We are left with fragments, and the honest story must leave room for uncertainty. Still, uncertainty does not mean emptiness. It means we should imagine the ancient world as full of small decisions under pressure. A band may decide not to return to a shelter because signs of strangers remain there. A young adult may join another group because the old group is too small. A family may learn a new method because the old method is failing in a changed landscape. A child born from two populations may grow up belonging to a new circle, carrying ancestry from one world and habits from another. Over time, these small crossings can alter the future more deeply than a single confrontation. A population can lose territory without one clear defeat. It can lose numbers without one clear disaster. It can lose its distinctness through repeated contact, borrowing, movement, and intermarriage. And in the case of ancient humans, this may be part of why vanishing is so hard to define. The meeting with Homo sapiens may have brought danger, but also connection. It may have intensified competition, but also opened channels through which some traces continued. It may have helped end separate communities while carrying pieces of those communities forward. That is not a simple victory story. It is a more unsettled human story, one in which survival and disappearance can be woven together so tightly that later generations struggle to separate them. The meeting between Homo sapiens and other ancient humans may be one of the most important parts of the story, but it is also one of the easiest to make too simple. We want a scene. We want one group arriving, one group retreating, one clear reason, one final answer. But the deep past rarely gives us that kind of shape. Contact between human populations could happen again and again, across different regions, under different conditions, with different results. In some places, the presence of Homo sapiens may have increased competition for food, shelter, stone, and space. In other places, groups may have remained apart for long periods, close enough to affect one another's movements, but not close enough for daily contact. Somewhere else, there may have been learning, cautious exchange, short conflicts, shared landscapes, or children whose ancestry crossed a boundary that later scientists would try to name. The important point is not to soften the story until nothing happened. Something did happen. The human world became narrower. Separate ancient human communities faded. Some branches of the human family stopped continuing as visible living groups, but the process may not have looked like a single replacement from the inside. It may have looked like many small changes accumulating until the old separation could no longer hold. A group that was already small might meet a larger network of Homo sapiens and find its choices reduced. A shelter might become less safe. A hunting area might be shared unwillingly. A young person might leave for another group because the future there seemed less fragile. A family might join outsiders after hunger, loss, or isolation made staying apart too difficult. A child born from such contact might carry blood from an older population, but grow up inside a newer social world. In this way, the meeting with Homo sapiens could become both an ending and a continuation. It could help dissolve a distinct community while allowing some of its ancestry, knowledge, or habits to move forward. That is why the idea of vanishing becomes so strange here. If a population is pushed away and dies out, we recognize that as disappearance. If a population slowly joins another and loses its separate identity, we also recognize disappearance, but of a different kind. If some of its descendants live on without its name, language, or memory, the ending is real, but not absolute. This is not a convenient answer. It does not give us the clean comfort of saying that one group simply won and another simply lost. It asks us to imagine contact as a long, unsettled zone where danger and kinship could exist near each other. Homo sapiens may have brought pressure through numbers, mobility, wider social ties, and flexible survival strategies. Other ancient humans may have brought their own knowledge of landscapes, animals, tools, and cold places. The outcome was not decided by worth. It was decided through many conditions meeting at once: climate, population size, food, movement, social networks, chance, and the difficult fact that two human groups can be fully capable and still not have equal security. A small group does not have to be inferior to be absorbed. It only has to be under enough pressure that joining, retreating, or shrinking becomes more likely than remaining separate. This is the quiet center of the meeting. Contact did not need to erase ancient humans like a blade. It could wear away the boundaries that made them recognizable as themselves. The old camps might still be used for a time. The old tools might still be made by some hands. The old routes might still be remembered by elders. But new people were in the landscape now. New choices existed. New children belonged to more than one past. And with every generation, the line between one human group and another could become harder to draw. Later, we would try to reconstruct that line from bones, stone, and DNA. But the people living through it were not living inside our categories. They were trying to survive. They were deciding where to sleep, whom to trust, when to move, who could be welcomed, who should be feared, what could be learned, and what had to be left behind. Their disappearance may have been made from these decisions, not from one final event. This is why the meeting with Homo sapiens leads naturally into the next part of the story. Once contact is understood not only as conflict, but also as mixing, the question changes again. We are no longer asking only whether ancient humans were driven away, outcompeted, or killed. We are asking whether some of them vanished because they became part of us, not in memory, not in name, not as separate communities, but in the hidden inheritance carried by later bodies. That possibility does not remove the loss. It makes the loss more difficult to hold. It means that a human world can end, while some of its people continue. It means a branch can disappear from the living tree as a branch, while small parts of it remain in the wood. And perhaps this is why the question feels so haunting. Homo sapiens may not only have witnessed the vanishing of ancient humans. In some places, we may have been one of the ways they vanished. One of the quietest ways for a human group to vanish is not through death, but through becoming harder and harder to separate from another group. This may feel strange at first, because we are used to thinking of disappearance as absence. A people is there, and then it is not there. A camp is full, and then it is empty. A name is spoken, and then no one speaks it again. But in the ancient human story, disappearance can also happen through closeness. It can happen when borders between populations become thin enough that the old distinction no longer continues as a living identity. A group may lose its separate future not because every person dies without descendants, but because its descendants grow into another circle of belonging. Their children may carry ancestry from more than one population. Their bodies may hold traces of an older human group, while their daily life, their social ties, their learned habits, and their sense of kinship belong to a new community. In this way, vanishing becomes less like a fire going out, and more like one flame being drawn into a larger fire, still present in heat, but no longer visible as its own shape. This is where ancient DNA has changed the way we think about the deep past. For a long time, bones and tools gave us the strongest clues. They showed that different ancient humans existed. They showed that some were physically distinct. They showed where certain remains had been found, and sometimes roughly when they lived. But DNA added another kind of evidence, one that could reveal meetings the bones alone did not fully explain. It showed that some ancient human groups were not sealed away from the ancestors of living people. There was interbreeding. There were children born across boundaries that later scientists would draw with names such as Neanderthal, Denisovan, and Homo sapiens. This does not mean all ancient humans survived in us, and it does not mean disappearance was harmless. A small percentage of ancestry is not the same as a living people. It does not preserve a language, a childhood, a set of stories, a way of recognizing relatives, or the feeling of belonging to a separate community. But it does make the word vanished more complicated. If a group leaves descendants only by being absorbed into another population, then something continued and something ended. The biological thread may remain, while the social world that once held it disappears. That is the difficult truth at the center of this part of the story. Survival and loss are not always opposites. Sometimes they are woven together. A young person from a small ancient group may have joined another community because there were too few people left at home, or because food had become uncertain, or because contact had made new relationships possible. A child born from such a joining may have inherited features, immune responses, or fragments of ancestry from more than one source. Yet grown up learning the habits of only one living group, after many generations the descendants may no longer know that an older population was part of them. They may carry traces without memory. They may live because the past continued in them, while the past itself became unnamed. This kind of disappearance is especially haunting because it asks us to separate existence from recognition. To exist as ancestry is not the same as to exist as a people. To remain in DNA is not the same as to remain in voice. A vanished group may still be present in a faint biological sense, but absent in every ordinary human way. No elders to tell its stories, no children raised inside its separate traditions, no camps known as its own, no future generation saying we are the same people. And for ancient humans, where names, languages, and memories were not written down, that loss is almost total. We can detect fragments, but we cannot restore the living whole. So when we ask why ancient humans vanished, one answer may be that some did not vanish by being erased all at once. They vanished by becoming part of others until the boundary that once made them distinct could no longer be carried forward. This does not make their ending less real. It makes it more intimate, because it means the lost human world is not only behind us in caves and fossils. In some small and silent ways, it may also be within the long story of bodies that survived. To say that ancient humans mixed is easy. To imagine what mixing meant inside a life is much harder. The word sounds clean when we hear it in science, almost like two colors gently blending on a page. But for the people who lived through it, mixing was not an abstract process. It was made of meetings, choices, pressure, fear, need, closeness, and children. It may have begun with a stranger accepted near a fire. It may have begun with a young person leaving a shrinking group because there were too few possible partners left. It may have begun after a season of hunger, when joining another band was safer than staying apart. It may have begun through cautious familiarity between groups that had crossed the same valley many times, seeing each other first as danger, then as presence, then perhaps as people who could be understood enough to live near. We cannot know the private stories behind those ancient crossings. We should not invent them as if the evidence gives us voices it does not give. But we can say carefully that interbreeding was not just a genetic event. It was a human event. A child born from two populations did not grow up as a percentage of ancestry. That child grew up hungry or warm, carried or taught, watched or protected, inside a real community. The child may have learned the tool habits of one group, the roots of another, the gestures of the people who raised them, the foods available in the land around them. Over time, if such children became part of a larger population, the older boundary between groups could become thinner, not because someone decided that a people should disappear, but because belonging follows the living. A child belongs first to the arms that carry it, the voices that call it, the fires around which it sleeps, the people who teach it where to look for food and when to move. If the old group was already small, every child who grew into another circle could carry life forward while also reducing the chance that the old circle would continue as itself. This is the quiet paradox of absorption. It can be merciful for individuals and final for communities. A young person may survive by joining others. A child may have a better chance in a larger group. A family may escape isolation by becoming part of a wider network. Yet each act of survival may also loosen the threads of the older identity. After several generations, the difference that once separated one ancient human population from another may no longer be visible in daily life. People may still carry ancestry from the older group, but no longer know a separate set of elders, shelters, teachings, and memories that belong only to that group. The body remembers in one way, while culture forgets in another. This is why ancient DNA can feel both powerful and insufficient. It can reveal that a meeting happened somewhere in the past. It can show that a trace remained. It can tell us that the vanished were not always entirely outside the line that led to later humans. But DNA cannot tell us what was said when strangers first met. It cannot tell us whether a child was welcomed easily, or whether belonging had to be earned through years of shared hunger and movement. It cannot tell us which songs disappeared, which tool lessons continued, which old fears were carried into new camps, or which names were never spoken again. The genetic trace is real, but it is not the whole person. It is a surviving thread, not the woven cloth. And this distinction is essential for a truthful story. If we say ancient humans live on in us, we must say it with caution. Some genetic inheritance from ancient groups exists in many living people, but that does not mean those groups still exist as living societies. A living society needs more than inherited fragments. It needs continuity of people recognizing themselves together. It needs children raised within a shared world. It needs repeated practices, remembered places, learned relationships, and some form of memory that says this is who we are. When those things are gone, a population may be present in biology but absent as a people. For ancient humans whose languages and self-names are lost to us, that absence is almost impossible to repair. We can detect the faint shape of contact, but we cannot bring back the full human world that contact transformed. This makes the disappearance more complex than a simple ending. Some ancient human lines may have ended with no known descendants. Others may have ended by joining the ancestry of those who came after. In both cases, something vanished. In one case, the biological line may have stopped. In the other, the separate identity stopped. The second kind of ending is easy to misunderstand because it does not look like total loss. But imagine a community whose children no longer grow up knowing its old roots, whose tools are changed by other habits, whose stories are no longer told as their own, whose descendants live among others without carrying the old boundary forward. That community has vanished in a deeply human sense, even if small pieces of ancestry remain. And perhaps this is why the story of ancient humans feels so close to us. Their disappearance was not always distance. Sometimes it was intimacy. Sometimes the end of one human world came not through complete separation, but through becoming inseparable from another. The idea that ancient humans may have vanished by mixing can sound almost comforting, as if disappearance were not really disappearance at all. But that comfort must be handled carefully. A trace is not the same as a living world. A fragment of ancestry is not the same as a people gathered around their own fires, raising children inside their own patterns of belonging. If a small part of an ancient human group remains in later bodies, that is a remarkable form of continuation, but it does not bring back the full circle of life that once carried that group forward. It does not restore the language no one recorded, the names no one wrote down, the gestures that passed between parents and children, the quiet rules of trust, the remembered places, the warnings about weather, the stories told by elders, or the sense of being part of a distinct human community. This is why the disappearance through mixing is both gentler and more severe than it first appears. Gentler, because it means the ending was not always total erasure. More severe, because what remained was only a small part of what had been lost. In the deep human past, a community was never only biology. It was also attention, teaching, memory, habit, and shared time. It was the way people recognized one another in the dark. It was who could be trusted near a child. It was the path chosen when snow began early. It was the stone source remembered by a grandparent, the shelter repaired year after year, the way a meal was divided, the way fear was managed when unfamiliar tracks appeared near water. None of these things can be fully recovered from DNA. DNA can tell us that contact happened, and in some cases that descendants carried pieces of older populations forward. But DNA cannot tell us how a vanished group understood itself. It cannot tell us whether its children felt safe, whether its old people worried that fewer young voices were answering them, whether joining another group was felt as hope, sorrow, necessity, or simply life continuing in the only direction available. For the question of why ancient humans vanished, this matters because it keeps us from replacing one false story with another. The first false story says they simply failed and disappeared. The second false story says they did not truly disappear because a little of them remains in us. Both are too simple. The more honest truth sits between them. Some ancient humans did disappear as separate populations. Some left no known descendants. Some may have been absorbed into larger or more successful networks. Some genetic traces survived, but the social worlds that once gave those traces meaning did not. This is not a contradiction. It is the nature of human continuity. We are made of inheritances we do not remember. We carry histories that no longer have names. A body can preserve what memory has lost. But memory matters. A people is not only the passing of genes, it is also the passing of recognition. When recognition ends, a people can vanish even if a few biological threads continue. Imagine, slowly, a small group that has lived for many generations in a familiar region. Their numbers have declined. Nearby groups are changing. New people enter the landscape. Some meetings are tense, some useful, some intimate. A young woman joins another band. A child is born with ancestry from both. That child grows up learning the movements, roots, and social ties of the larger group. Some old habits remain, perhaps in the way a hide is worked, or the memory of a place, or a body's inheritance too small for anyone to see. But the child does not grow up inside the older community as a continuing whole. The next generation belongs even more fully to the new circle. After enough time, the old boundary no longer lives in anyone's daily world. No one has decided to erase it. No one has named the final moment, yet the separate group is gone. This is how vanishing through closeness may have worked. It is not dramatic, but it is profound. It suggests that the ancient human past was not a clean series of replacements, but a field of endings and continuations woven together. Some communities may have died out in isolation. Some may have been pushed to margins. Some may have joined others. Some may have contributed ancestry or knowledge before becoming invisible as separate groups. By the time later people look back, there were only fragments left, a bone, a tool layer, a trace in a genome, a question. And from those fragments, we try to rebuild not only who disappeared, but what kind of disappearance took place. This is why the story now has to turn toward the evidence itself. Bones, tools, sites, and ancient DNA can guide us, but they also have limits. They can show that ancient humans existed, that they moved, adapted, met, and sometimes mixed. Yet they cannot give us the whole of a vanished life. They cannot let us hear the first language of a child born between two groups, or know whether an elder saw that child as loss, survival, or both. They cannot show us every camp abandoned, every family absorbed, every memory fading into another people's future. The traces that remain are real, and they must be respected, but they are also incomplete. And when we ask why ancient humans vanished, we are always asking that question through evidence that survived by chance, while most of the human story passed away without leaving a voice. Everything we know about vanished ancient humans comes to us through what survived, and this is both the strength and the sadness of the story. A bone survives where a body once moved. A tooth survives where a mouth once chewed, breathed, perhaps spoke sounds we will never hear. A stone tool survives where a hand once learned pressure, angle, patience, and need. A hearth stain survives where warmth once gathered people close enough to see one another's faces in low light. Ancient DNA survives in rare conditions, hidden inside fragments that seem small until science makes them speak in a different language. These traces are real. They are not guesses pulled from imagination. They are the reason we can say that other ancient humans lived, adapted, moved, met, and sometimes mixed with the ancestors of later people. But every trace is also incomplete. It carries one kind of truth while leaving many other truths outside its reach. A bone can tell us something about anatomy, age, injury, diet, or relationship to other populations, but it cannot tell us the name a child heard when someone called them closer to the fire. A tool can tell us that skill existed, and sometimes that a tradition was shared across places or changed through time, but it cannot tell us exactly what a teacher said to a learner, or whether the learner was afraid, proud, tired, hungry, or grieving. A site can show repeated use of a cave, a shelter, or an open landscape, but it cannot preserve every reason people came there, every argument about leaving, every memory attached to the place. This matters deeply for the question of why ancient humans vanished, because evidence does not arrive as a complete story. It arrives as fragments, and fragments must be handled with humility. If we find fewer bones from a certain group after a certain period, that may suggest population decline, movement, absorption, or disappearance. But it may also reflect preservation, excavation, dating limits, or the simple fact that most lives do not fossilize. If one tool tradition fades from an area, that may suggest the people who made it left, changed, mixed with others, or adopted different methods. But the tool alone cannot always tell us which of those things happened. If ancient DNA shows interbreeding, it reveals contact across populations, yet it does not tell us the emotional or social shape of that contact. It cannot tell us whether the meeting was brief or repeated, peaceful or tense, chosen or forced by circumstance. The evidence speaks, but it speaks carefully, and we should not force it into a louder voice than it has. This is one of the most important safeguards for a truthful video about ancient humans. The mystery should not be filled with invented certainty. The gaps should remain visible, not as weakness, but as honesty. The deep past is not a complete library with missing labels. It is more like a few pages rescued from a fire, some clear, some torn, some darkened at the edges, all belonging to books we may never fully recover. From those pages, scientists compare dates, layers, bones, stone tools, environments, and genomes. They build cautious models. They revise them when new finds appear. They test ideas against evidence. This is why the story changes over time, not because truth is meaningless, but because the surviving record is small, and new methods can reveal things earlier generations could not see. Ancient humans vanished long before anyone wrote down what was happening. No witness left a diary saying the neighbouring group was smaller this year, or the old route had failed, or children were being raised among strangers, or a certain kind of human was becoming rare. We have to infer from remains, and inference is not the same as invention. It means following what the evidence allows, while refusing to pretend that we know the parts it does not show. When we ask why ancient humans vanished, bones and tools can point toward climate stress, population change, mobility, contact, cultural shifts, and mixing. DNA can reveal hidden relationships and traces of ancestry. Sites can show occupation and abandonment. But none of these can fully restore the inner life of a vanished community. They cannot give us the last conversation before a camp moved. They cannot show us the first time a child from one population slept safely among another. They cannot tell us whether an elder understood that the world they knew was ending. So the evidence gives us a path, but not a complete map. It lets us walk nearer to the vanished, while reminding us that nearness is not possession. We can know that they existed. We can know that some endured harsh environments for long spans of time. We can know that some met and mixed with Homo sapiens. We can know that separate ancient human communities eventually ceased to continue, but the exact texture of their vanishing remains partly beyond us, held in the silence between the fragments that survived and the lives that did not. The evidence for vanished ancient humans does not lie to us, but it can be easy to ask more from it than it can give. A bone is honest about the part of the body it preserves, but it is not honest about a whole life unless we compare it carefully with other bones, other places, other dates, and other traces. A stone tool is honest about a human action, but it does not always tell us whose hand made it, what language surrounded it, whether the maker belonged to a shrinking group or a growing one, whether the tool was part of an old tradition or a newly borrowed habit. A layer of sediment may hold a hearth, animal remains, and worked stone, but the layer itself is not a memory. It is a compressed surface of time, sometimes disturbed, sometimes incomplete, sometimes preserving one season better than 1,000 ordinary days. This is why the story of ancient humans must move slowly. When we find a gap, we should not immediately call it a final disappearance. When we find a change in tools, we should not immediately call it replacement. When we find signs of mixing, we should not immediately imagine a simple peaceful joining or a simple violent taking. The deep past asks for patience, because almost every clue can point in more than one direction. If a site that once held evidence of one ancient human group later holds evidence associated with another, several things may have happened. The first group may have left before the second arrived. They may have overlapped briefly. They may have used the place in different seasons. One group may have adopted practices from another. The older population may have declined, moved, mixed, or been absorbed. There may also be parts of the story that left no trace at all. A wooden tool decays, a hide shelter disappears, a spoken warning vanishes as soon as breath leaves the mouth. A child carried from one group into another leaves no separate mark unless bone or DNA happens to survive. Because of this, the silence between discoveries is not empty in a simple way. It is full of possibilities that evidence has not preserved. For a truthful account, we have to let that silence remain partly silent. This does not weaken the story. It protects it. It keeps us from pretending that ancient humans vanished for one neat reason just because one neat reason is easier to narrate. The fossil record itself is uneven. Some environments preserve bone better than others. Cold, dry, or protected places may keep traces that warm, wet, acidic, or open landscapes destroy. A group living in one region may become visible to science because the ground was kind to its remains. Another group living with equal richness may become almost invisible because its traces dissolved, scattered, or were never found. The result is that our picture of ancient humans is shaped not only by who lived, but by what survived and what has been discovered. Even DNA, powerful as it is, depends on preservation. It is not available from every place or every period. It can reveal relationships where preservation is good and leave silence where preservation is poor. This is why we should be careful with absence. The absence of evidence is not always evidence that no one was there. Sometimes it means the earth did not keep them, or we have not yet found them, or the tools and shelters they used were made of materials that time returned to soil. At the same time, we cannot use uncertainty as permission to invent anything we want. That would be another kind of mistake. The honest path is narrower. We can say that ancient human groups existed. We can say that some disappeared as separate populations. We can say that climate, small numbers, contact, competition, and mixing are all plausible parts of the larger pattern, supported in different ways by archaeology, fossils, and genetics. But we should also say that the exact balance of causes may have varied from place to place. What happened to Neanderthal groups in Western Eurasia may not be the same as what happened to Denisovan-related populations in parts of Asia. What happened in one valley may not explain another. Disappearance was likely not a single event spreading evenly across the world, but many local endings and transformations seen from far away as one broad vanishing. This is why the evidence must be treated like a dim lamp rather than a flood of light. It shows enough to guide us, but not enough to remove all shadow. And perhaps that shadow is part of the truth. The vanished ancient humans were not created for us to understand completely. They lived for themselves in their own present, leaving only what time allowed to remain. When we ask why they vanished, we are not standing above the whole answer. We are kneeling beside fragments, trying to listen carefully without forcing them to say more than they can. The limits of evidence do not make the vanished ancient humans less real. In some ways, those limits make them feel more real, because every fragment reminds us how much of ordinary life is never preserved. A person can love a child, remember a path, fear a winter, teach a hand, share food, wait through pain, and disappear from the earth without leaving anything that can be named. Most human lives, even now, would leave very little if all writing, all memory, all photographs, and all spoken testimony were taken away. In the deep past, that was the normal condition. Life happened fully, but only a small part of it hardened into evidence. This is why bones, tools, sites, and DNA must be treated with a kind of quiet respect. They are not the whole story, but they are the only doorway we have. Through them, we can see that ancient humans were not imaginary figures. We can see that they had bodies adapted to real environments, that they used materials with skill, that they occupied places repeatedly, that they endured changing climates, that some groups met other human populations, and that some traces of those meetings still appear in later ancestry. Yet the doorway is narrow. We cannot walk through it and pretend to stand inside their minds. We cannot know every reason a camp was left empty, every pressure that made one group move, every illness that weakened a family, every child who crossed from one population into another and grew up under a different circle of belonging. The evidence gives us outlines, not full voices. It gives us edges, not the warmth inside the room. For a truthful story about why ancient humans vanished, this should shape the tone from beginning to end. We should not speak as if we were witnesses. We should speak as careful listeners. We can say that disappearance likely involved several pressures working together: changing environments, small and scattered populations, fragile social networks, competition or contact with Homo sapiens, and in some cases interbreeding and absorption. We can say that these pressures may have differed by region and by group. We can say that some populations may have died out, while others may have blended into larger human networks until their separate identity was no longer carried forward. But we should not pretend that every vanished group followed the same path. The ancient world was too large, too varied, and too poorly preserved for that. A story that claims one simple answer may sound strong, but it becomes weaker the moment the evidence is handled honestly. A slower answer may feel less dramatic, but it is stronger because it leaves room for what we do not know. This matters especially because the vanished ancient humans are often treated as symbols. Sometimes they are made into symbols of failure. Sometimes they are made into symbols of mystery. Sometimes they are turned into dramatic rivals, silent victims, lost geniuses, or almost modern shadows. But they were not symbols first. They were living beings inside their own days. The evidence should bring us closer to that, not pull us into fantasy. A Neanderthal bone is not just a clue in an argument. It once belonged to a body that needed warmth, food, rest, and others. A Denisovan genetic trace is not just a scientific surprise. It points toward meetings between human populations whose full stories are gone. A stone tool is not just a marker of culture. It is the remains of attention, repetition, and teaching. When we remember this, the question, why did ancient humans vanish, becomes less like a puzzle we are trying to win, and more like a careful act of reconstruction. We are not only asking what removed them from the world, we are asking what kinds of human life the world once held, and why those forms did not continue as visible communities. The evidence can guide us toward that question, but it also humbles us before it. It tells us that the past was richer than the record. It tells us that absence is not emptiness. It tells us that the people who vanished may have left more behind than we can prove, and also lost more than any surviving trace can show. By the end of this part of the story, we have reached an important boundary. We have looked at climate, small numbers, technology, contact, mixing, and the evidence itself. None of these gives a single clean answer. Together, they form a more honest shape. Ancient humans likely vanished through different combinations of pressure, loss, movement, absorption, and chance. But before we move toward the ending, there is one more idea that must be corrected. Vanishing is often imagined as failure. We look at the fact that only Homo sapiens remains, and we are tempted to see the others as those who could not keep up. But that may be one of the most unfair ways to look at them. A group can live for hundreds of thousands of years and still eventually disappear. A population can be intelligent, adapted, skilled, and caring, and still lose its separate future. The fact that a human branch ended does not mean it was meaningless, weak, or inferior. It may simply mean that time, pressure, and circumstance narrowed the human world until fewer forms remained. And if we want to understand why ancient humans vanished without turning them into failures, we have to ask not only why they ended, but how long, and how well they had already lived before the ending came. To vanish is not always to fail. This may be one of the hardest ideas to hold, because the present has a way of flattering itself. We look around and see only one living human species, and because we are here to do the looking, we are tempted to imagine that our survival was the proof of our superiority in every possible sense. The others are gone, so they must have been less capable. The others left no living communities of their own, so they must have been weaker, slower, less inventive, less human. But this is not a careful way to read the deep past. It is the kind of story that survivors often tell without noticing the arrogance hidden inside it. A branch that ends is not the same as a branch that never flourished. A people who vanish after an immense span of time cannot be dismissed as if their whole existence were only a failed attempt to become us. Many ancient humans endured environments that were harsh, unstable, and demanding. They survived cold periods, shifting landscapes, dangerous animals, injuries, hunger, and isolation. They made tools. They used fire. They learned where to move and when to wait. They raised children in worlds without farms, cities, writing, metal, or stored abundance. Their survival did not last for a few seasons. In some cases, it lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. That length of time should make us pause. Most things humans build today do not last even a small fraction of that. Most kingdoms, nations, languages, beliefs, borders, and technologies change quickly when measured against deep time. Yet these ancient human groups lived long enough for generation after generation to be born, taught, fed, protected, and remembered by someone. If that is failure, then the word failure has become too small and too careless. The disappearance of ancient humans should not erase the reality of their endurance. It should make their endurance more striking. They were not waiting at the edge of history to be judged by us. They were living inside their own present, meeting the demands of their own worlds. A Neanderthal group surviving in Ice Age Europe did not need to invent a modern city to prove intelligence. It needed to know cold, stone, animals, bodies, shelter, risk, and cooperation. A Denisovan-related population living somewhere across Asia did not need to leave a written archive to have lived meaningfully. It needed to continue through births, movement, learning, and adaptation in landscapes we only partly understand. Other ancient humans, some still known from limited fossils and debated relationships, were not lesser because the earth preserved them poorly. They were part of the broad human story, whether or not the record is generous enough to show us their lives clearly. This is why the question, why did ancient humans vanish, must not be turned into a question of moral ranking. Evolution is not a ceremony that awards value to the last group standing. Survival is shaped by many things: numbers, timing, geography, disease, climate, food, social networks, chance, and contact with others. A population can have strengths that serve it well for thousands of generations, then face a combination of pressures that those strengths cannot fully overcome. A body adapted to cold may struggle when the pattern of cold and warmth keeps shifting. A group skilled in hunting may suffer when the animals it knows change routes or decline. A small population may carry rich knowledge, but still become too thin to recover from repeated losses. A community may endure for ages, and then disappear not because it lacked worth, but because the world changed faster, wider, or more unevenly than its future could absorb. This does not make the ending less real. It makes the judgment less cruel. When a forest burns after centuries of growth, we do not say the trees failed because they did not live forever. When a river changes course, we do not say the old channel was meaningless because water no longer flows there. Ancient human groups were living channels of adaptation, memory, and relationship. Some ended, some merged. Some left traces, some vanished from every form of recognition we can recover. But ending is not proof that they were mistakes. It is proof that life, even intelligent life, is never outside time. And when we understand this, the story becomes quieter, more respectful, and more truthful. The vanished were not defeated characters in a story written for Homo sapiens. They were humans of their own worlds, and before we ask why they disappeared, we must remember how long they had already remained. Survival has a way of looking obvious only after it has already happened. Once one line continues and another ends, the surviving line seems as if it must have carried an inner promise all along. We look backward and mistake the result for destiny. Homo sapiens remained, so Homo sapiens must have been meant to remain. Other ancient humans vanished, so they must have been meant to vanish. But deep history is not that orderly. It is not a staircase rising toward us, and it is not a test in which the best answer is always preserved. Survival can depend on intelligence, but also on numbers. It can depend on flexibility, but also on geography. It can depend on social networks, but also on timing. It can depend on the luck of being in a place where food remained available, where neighbors could still be reached, where children survived, where contact brought new possibilities instead of only danger. A group may be highly capable and still stand in the wrong place when climates shift. Another may be no more worthy in any moral sense, but have larger networks, wider movement, or simply more chances to recover when hardship comes. This does not make survival meaningless. It makes it humbling. It means we should not use our existence as proof that every other human way was lesser. The ancient humans who vanished may have had strengths that were exactly right for their worlds for a very long time. Neanderthals, for example, lived across difficult environments and endured repeated climatic changes. They were not a brief mistake. They were a long presence. Their bodies, tools, sites, and traces of care suggest a human life that answered real conditions with real skill. Yet a strength that works in one pattern of life may become less protective when several pressures change together. A close knowledge of certain landscapes matters less if those landscapes stop offering the same animals. A small, intimate community may be deeply cooperative, but less able to recover if repeated losses reduce its numbers. A tradition may be stable and effective, but less able to spread new solutions if social networks are narrow. None of this requires a judgment of inferiority. It only requires recognizing that adaptation is always local, always historical, always tied to conditions that can change. This is why the vanished should not be imagined as humans who could not solve life. They solved life again and again, through countless mornings we will never see. They found food, raised children, healed injuries when they could, warmed themselves, moved through seasons, learned from one another, and endured. Their ending does not erase the truth of those days. A river that no longer flows where it once flowed was still a river. A language no longer spoken was still a complete world to the people who spoke it. A human group no longer present was still fully alive while it lived. If we reduce their story to disappearance, we make the ending swallow the whole existence. That is unfair to the deep past, and it also makes the question less interesting. The more truthful question is not why did the weak vanish and the strong remain. It is why did certain forms of human life, after surviving for so long, become unable to continue separately under a changing set of pressures. That question leaves room for dignity. It allows intelligence and disappearance to exist in the same story. It allows a group to be skilled and vulnerable, adapted and fragile, successful for a long time and still eventually gone. It also helps us understand Homo sapiens more honestly. And CD, our survival was real, but it was not a guarantee written into nature. Our ancestors also passed through bottlenecks, migrations, uncertainty, hunger, and danger. They were not outside the same rules. They too depended on children living, elders teaching, groups connecting, tools working, landscapes providing, and chance allowing enough time for recovery. If the outcome had been different in some regions, if climates had shifted differently, if small groups had remained isolated in another pattern, if contact had taken another form, the human present might not look the way it does now. This does not mean we should imagine impossible alternatives as fact. It simply means the present should not make us arrogant. The fact that only Homo sapiens remains visible today is not a license to turn the others into failures. It is a reminder that the human story was once broader and that survival narrowed it. The vanished ancient humans were not failed versions of us. They were other answers to the problem of being human in difficult worlds. Some answers lasted a very long time. Some ended. Some merged into later people. Some left only fragments behind. And if we listen carefully, those fragments do not say, "We were lesser." They say, "We were here." We lived in the cold, the forest, the cave mouth, the river valley, the open plain. We met the world as it was given to us. We carried children, tools, fire, hunger, memory, and fear. We continued until the conditions for continuing separately were no longer enough. That is not a simple failure. It is a human ending inside a world where no living form is promised forever. There is a quiet dignity in lasting, even when lasting does not mean lasting forever. Ancient humans who vanished did not need to reach the present to have mattered. Their lives were not valuable only if they became our lives. This is something the modern mind must learn slowly, because we are used to measuring the past by what it gave to us. We ask what led to modern humans, what led to our tools, our bodies, our migrations, our survival. Those questions are useful, but they can also make every other human path seem like a side road. They can make a vanished group appear important only when it contributed something to us, through ancestry, technology, or comparison. But an ancient human community did not need to leave a visible inheritance in order to have been complete in its own time. A child warmed beside a fire was not incomplete because no one would remember the child's name. An elder teaching a route through winter snow was not less wise because the teaching would not survive in writing. A hunter repairing a tool, a mother carrying food, a young person watching the sky for weather, a group resting beneath a rock shelter after a long movement across cold ground. These moments were not rehearsals for our future. They were life itself. When such communities vanished, what ended was not a failed experiment. What ended was a real human present that had once filled the world with attention, care, danger, and meaning. This is why saying that vanishing is not always failure is not only a scientific correction, it is also a moral correction in the way we imagine the deep past. We should not give respect only to the line that survived. Survival is not the same as worth. The ancient human groups that disappeared may have had forms of knowledge that were perfectly suited to places and seasons we no longer know how to read. They may have understood cold winds, animal movement, stone qualities, shelter, fire, injury, and cooperation with a precision that would be difficult for modern people to imagine. They may have cared for one another in ways that left only partial traces, or no traces at all. They may have endured hardship not through heroic drama, but through repeated ordinary competence, waking, moving, mending, feeding, watching, teaching, remembering. If their separate communities ended, that ending should make us think more deeply about fragility, not about inferiority. A long-surviving group can still disappear when the balance around it changes. A successful way of life can stop being possible when climate shifts, food changes, numbers decline, networks thin, and contact with other populations alters the old world. This is not failure in the simple sense. It is the vulnerability of all living systems. No species, no community, no culture, No memory is protected from time by deserving to continue. The world does not preserve what is worthy. It preserves what can continue under conditions that are often uneven, unstable, and partly governed by chance. That truth can feel cold, but it is also honest. It prevents us from using the present as a throne. It reminds us that Homo sapiens did not survive because the universe promised us the earth. We survived because our ancestors passed through enough narrow openings, enough children lived, enough groups connected, enough ideas spread, enough environments allowed movement, enough chances were not missed. Other ancient humans passed through many narrow openings too, for a very long time. Then, in different places and different ways, some openings closed. Their communities shrank, moved, mixed, or ended. Some lines left descendants inside later people. Some left only bone and stone. Some may be known from fragments so small that their full worlds remain hidden from us. But none of that gives us the right to call them failures. It gives us the responsibility to speak of them carefully. As this part of the story comes to rest, the question of why ancient humans vanished has changed shape. It no longer asks us to find one weakness. It asks us to understand how many strengths can still fail to guarantee permanence. It asks us to see intelligence without immortality, adaptation without certainty, survival without destiny. The vanished ancient humans were not lesser simply because they are gone. They were part of the broader human family, and their disappearance is one of the reasons that family now looks smaller than it once was. When we look at a bone, a tool, a trace in DNA, or an empty layer of earth, we are not looking at the remains of meaninglessness. We are looking at the edge of a life world that once had its own center. The final movement of this story must begin there, not with the idea that they failed to become us, but with the quieter question of what remains when a human world ends, and what kind of humility the living owe to those who can no longer speak for themselves. When a human world ends, it does not end only in the ground. It ends in the places where memory can no longer reach. A camp may be abandoned, and the wind may move dust over the old floor. A shelter may collapse, and the stones may settle into the slope until they look like part of the hill. A bone may lie in darkness for thousands of years. A tool may wait beside animal remains, still sharp enough to show intention but no longer surrounded by the hands that understood it. These are the visible endings, the ones the earth sometimes keeps. But another ending is harder to see. It happens when no child grows up hearing the old warnings, when no elder points toward the old route, when no one knows why a certain place was once avoided, trusted, feared, or loved. It happens when a way of recognizing the world has no living mind left to carry it. This is what remains when ancient humans vanish, not only fossils and fragments, but the awareness that whole worlds of attention have passed beyond recovery. The Neanderthal who knew a cold valley did not know that one day the valley would be studied through sediment and bone. The Denisovan-related person whose ancestry moved into later populations did not know that a trace of that life might one day be found in a genome. The small groups whose names are lost did not live as evidence. They lived as people, and only later did evidence become the language through which we try to approach them. That should make us careful. It should make the ending of this story quieter, not louder. Because after all the pressures we have followed, climate, food, small numbers, fragile networks, tools that helped but could not guarantee permanence, contact with Homo sapiens, and the strange continuation through mixing the deepest lesson is not that ancient humans were doomed. It is that human continuity is more fragile than it feels from the present. We are used to imagining ourselves as stable because we are alive now, because our species fills the earth, because our voices are everywhere. But the deep past reminds us that being human has never been a promise of permanence. It has always depended on bodies, children, care, memory, chance, and the world remaining livable enough for the next generation to learn what the previous one knew. The vanished ancient humans show us that a community is not held together by intelligence alone. It is held by relationships. It is held by enough people to teach and enough people to listen. It is held by places that still answer old knowledge. It is held by contact that helps more than it harms, by food that returns often enough, by children who survive long enough to become memory keepers themselves, though they would never have used such a phrase. When those supports weaken, a world can end slowly while life still continues nearby. This may be the most difficult part to understand. The end of an ancient human world may not have left a silence that anyone recognized at the time. It may have looked like a family joining another group. It may have looked like young people moving away because there were too few partners at home. It may have looked like a familiar shelter used less often, then not at all. It may have looked like an old tool form becoming rare, then disappearing from the hands of children. It may have looked like a trace of ancestry passing forward while the old circle of belonging dissolved. From far away, we call this vanishing. From within, it may have felt like the ordinary pressure to keep living. That is why the question, why did ancient humans vanish, cannot be answered only by naming causes. Causes matter, and we have followed them as carefully as we can. But the causes lead to a larger understanding. Disappearance is not always a single event, and survival is not always a complete victory. Something can continue and end at the same time. A biological thread can remain while a language, a memory, a way of life, and a separate community are gone. A tool can survive while the teaching around it disappears. A bone can survive while the face, voice, fear, patience, and tenderness of the person are unreachable. What remains, then, is not enough to restore them, but enough to ask us to respect them. It asks us not to turn them into monsters, not to turn them into failures, not to turn them into a mystery so exaggerated that truth is lost. It asks us to see them as human relatives who lived under real skies, in real cold, with real hunger, real skill, real care, and real limits. And perhaps the value of this story, especially near sleep, is that it softens our certainty. It reminds us that the human past was broader than the human present. It reminds us that what is gone was not empty, and what survives was not inevitable. It reminds us that every living world, including our own, is made of small continuities that must be protected before anyone notices they are fading. The vanished ancient humans leave us with an uncomfortable kind of education, not the kind that gives a simple lesson, but the kind that changes how we look at ourselves. They teach us that being human is not a single shape moving confidently through time. It is a fragile arrangement of bodies, places, relationships, memories, and chances. For most of our history, human life did not rest on certainty. It rested on whether children lived through winter, whether elders survived long enough to teach, whether groups met often enough to exchange partners and knowledge, whether the land still answered the memories people carried, whether a fire could be kept, whether food could be found before hunger weakened the group too much to search again. Ancient humans vanished when some of these arrangements broke, or changed, or became absorbed into other arrangements. That is not a story only about them. It is also a mirror, though it should be a quiet one. It reminds us that no community continues simply because it believes it should. Continuity has to be carried. It has to be taught, renewed, protected, and adapted without being torn apart. A tool tradition continues only when someone shows a younger hand how to strike stone. A route continues only when someone walks it with someone else. A memory continues only when it is told before the person who holds it is gone. A people continues only when enough living relationships make the next generation possible. When we think of vanished ancient humans, we often focus on the dramatic absence. No living Neanderthal villages, no Denisovan language spoken under mountain skies, no separate communities of other ancient human groups waking into the modern world. But perhaps the more useful thought is quieter. Their absence asks us to notice the small things that allow any human world to remain. Care matters, teaching matters, connection matters. Diversity of knowledge matters. Contact can threaten a group, but it can also help it survive. Isolation can protect a group for a time, but it can also make recovery harder when losses come. Skill matters, but skill alone cannot carry a future if there are too few people to learn it. Intelligence matters, but intelligence must live inside bodies that need food, warmth, rest, and one another. This is the educational value of their disappearance. It does not tell us to fear the past. It tells us to respect complexity. It tells us not to reduce human history to winners and losers. It tells us that some endings happen through death, some through movement, some through mixing, some through silence, and some through the slow fading of connections that once seemed ordinary. In our own lives, we may never face the same conditions as those ancient groups, but we still live inside fragile continuities. A family story can vanish if no one asks about it. A language can weaken if children stop hearing it. A craft can disappear if no one has time to learn. A place can lose meaning if people no longer remember what happened there. These are not the same as the extinction of ancient human populations, and we should not confuse them, but they help us feel, in a small and human way, what it means for a world to end without a loud final moment. The deep past teaches that loss often begins before anyone calls it loss. It begins when fewer people carry the memory, when fewer hands repeat the practice, when fewer children inherit the path, when the old knowledge has no safe place to go. This does not make the story hopeless. In fact, it makes it more tender, because if disappearance can be slow, then attention also matters. Remembering matters. Caring for evidence matters. Speaking carefully about the vanished matters. Every fossil studied honestly. Every tool interpreted cautiously. Every fragment of DNA handled without exaggeration. Every refusal to turn ancient humans into monsters or failures becomes a small act of respect toward worlds that can no longer explain themselves. We cannot give those worlds back their voices. We cannot restore their lost names. We cannot know the full warmth of their fires or the full fear of their difficult seasons. But we can avoid making their silence serve our arrogance. We can let them teach us that survival is never simple, that loss is not always deserved, and that the human story was once wider than the narrow present we inherited. At the end of this long question, the vanished ancient humans do not become simple. They do not turn into one answer, one cause, one final scene beneath a cold sky. They remain what the evidence has allowed them to be: real, close to us, partly known, and partly beyond reach. We can follow the signs far enough to understand that their disappearance was not likely a single event shared by every group in the same way. It was not just climate, though climate changed the ground beneath every life. It was not just small numbers, though small numbers made every loss heavier. It was not just tools, because tools showed intelligence but could not guarantee permanence. It was not just Homo sapiens, though contact with our ancestors may have brought competition, pressure, exchange, and mixing. It was not just interbreeding, because a trace inside later bodies is not the same as a living community. It was not just the silence of the fossil record, because silence can come from both true absence and the limits of preservation. The more honest answer is slower than that. Ancient humans vanished through different combinations of pressure, chance, movement, isolation, contact, decline, and absorption. Some may have died out completely. Some may have blended into later populations. Some may have left knowledge or habits that we can no longer separate from the hands that carried them forward. Some may have vanished so completely that even their traces have not yet been found. And behind all of those possibilities were not abstractions, but lives. There were eyes watching weather change. There were hands making tools beside firelight. There were children learning where to step, what to touch, what to fear, what to follow. There were elders carrying maps that had never been drawn, and when those elders died, some of those maps may have died with them. There were groups who knew the world in ways we can only approach through fragments. They did not know they were ancient. They did not know they would become a question. They lived forward as all people do, not knowing what later ages would call their ending. And perhaps that is the quietest truth this story leaves behind. No one lives as a vanished people. No one wakes and says, "We are the ones who will become a gap in the record." They wake into hunger, weather, care, fatigue, hope, and the ordinary work of continuing. They make choices for the next day, not for the museum. They carry children because the child is cold, not because the species must survive. They join others because life is safer together, not because one day someone will call it absorption. They leave a shelter because food has moved, not because an archaeological layer needs to end. They do not see the whole pattern. Neither do we, completely. We see more than they could see in one way, because we can compare bones, tools, climates, and genomes across enormous time. But we see less in another way, because we cannot feel the full life that surrounded each trace. So the most valuable ending may not be certainty, it may be humility. The vanished ancient humans remind us that the human story was once wider than the present, and that our own survival is not proof that all other ways of being human were lesser. They remind us that a community is a delicate living bridge between past and future, carried by memory, teaching, children, relationships, and place. They remind us that what disappears may have been strong for a very long time before it became fragile. They remind us that evidence should be treated with care, and silence should not be filled with fantasy. Most of all, they remind us that to be human is not only to survive as a body, but to be recognized, taught, remembered, and carried forward inside a living world. When that world ends, something more than biology is lost. A way of noticing the earth is lost. A way of holding fear is lost. A way of protecting children is lost. A way of naming home is lost. We may still find bones. We may still read genomes. We may still hold stone tools in our hands and feel the patience of another hand across time. But we cannot return the vanished to themselves. We can only listen as carefully as the fragments allow, and let their absence change the way we think about presence. Somewhere in the long dark behind us, there were other humans looking at rivers, fires, animals, stars, and children with minds that were not ours, yet not entirely separate from ours. Their worlds ended, or merged, or faded, or became hidden inside later life. And now, only one human species remains to ask the question, standing at the edge of a much older silence. When a human world disappears, what is truly gone, and what is still quietly waiting inside what remains?